My slides are coming soon here. There we go. So my name's Dave Troy. I am a serial entrepreneur and data visualization enthusiast. I first got involved doing data visualization work in 2007 when I did a real-time visualization of all of the traffic on Twitter. And at that time, you could actually visualize all of the traffic on Twitter. And there was so little of it. And that actually made it into the Museum of Modern Art, and I realized that this was something that people were interested in, and that it was, I was scratching an itch for myself, but that other people were interested in this as well. So what I'm going to do today is kind of give you an overview of some different projects that I've done in the context of both visualizing social media data as well as visualizing data in the context of startups, and specifically with some information on Bulgaria as well. So, as I said there, I've been in 16 countries in the last 8 months talking about these topics, and it's been kind of a whirlwind tour. So it's fantastic to be here. Bear with me a little bit. I am a little bit jet lagged and just the weetsiest bit hungover. But other than that, it should be just fine. So anyway, data visualization at its best should really offer us a new way of seeing and really offer us new insights into how things work. So I want to kind of differentiate that from things like infographics and other things that might be nice marketing objects that you can sort of pass around on the internet and share on social media, and think more about real visualization and things that go into, like basically visualization is taking raw data, pushing it through algorithms, and then seeing the results. Sometimes with some editorial input, but typically, you're sort of passing directly from the data to what you're seeing with your eyes. So I'm going to start with a little bit of analysis of the European investor community. This is data from AngelList, and what you see here is a network graph. And this is, I want to first say that none of the maps that I'm going to show you today are geographic maps. These are maps of communities and how connections form. So for each of these dots here, what you have is an individual investor or company, and then the lines represent connections between them. And the clustering here happens naturally when you lay them out based on the connections between them. So the relationships act kind of like springs, and they pull people together. So what you end up with is clearly defined clusters where people sort of group into groups, like, this is Russia and Israel and Turkey and things like that. So people group into these clusters just by virtue of the data itself. You can also use data from like AngelList to look at markets. So this is a visualization of all of the email startups. I have a company that's in the email space. We make a product called Maelstrom, and we wanted to see how central we were, because if you do study networks and whatnot, what you find is that centrality is a key factor to success for entities within a network. So we're actually pretty close to the center here, and that was good to see. And then you can kind of go all macro and look at things from a very big perspective. This is a map of all of the angel investors that are on AngelList in the United States. And what you see here is some interesting trends. This group down here is grouped out of New York, and then you've got kind of a Boston group up here, and then a San Francisco cluster here, and then people that kind of play in the middle. The really big one right there is Dave McClure, because he's like invested in like all known deals. But at any rate, you get a real sense of how the network is put together and how you might go about finding investors, things like that, by studying this type of analysis. So this is another type of visualization that I did using data from LinkedIn. And what I wanted to understand here was, who are the employers in my city, Baltimore, Maryland, and how do they interconnect? So what I did was made a graph of all the different employers connected by the employees that they had ever shared, so that the relationships were the employees. And what you find is that Johns Hopkins University is the largest employer. That makes sense. And then a bunch of things in the education space right around it, all in blue. And then down here, this is the financial services sector. So like T. Rowe Price and Legg Mason, they're big US-based sort of banking firms. And then over here, you have kind of the military-industrial complex, things like Northrop Grumman and the U.S. Army and things like that. And then up here, the media, things like newspapers and things along those lines. And this is a really interesting type of graph that you can understand how your place works. And we're going to kind of get into how you can make these and what some of the issues are and all that as we go forward. But I wanted to kind of give you a ramping up of different types of things you can do with this kind of analysis. This is an analysis of some customers of ours. We wanted to understand what email marketers were co-occurring with each other in a specific set of customers. And so we made a visualization that showed like Amazon.com correlates with Apple, correlates with Groupon, correlates with Living Social, and then there's some others up here that group together. And then you can go to those marketers and say, here's the things that co-occur with the people that you're reaching with your market. Now, this is another thing that we're working on. The color's a little bit off. It's not quite that weird looking. But this is an email tool that we're building for iOS. It'll be out later this year. And basically using visualization to look at the inbox from an entirely new perspective. So you can actually manipulate each of these tiles and move things around. The main point here is like we have these super high-powered touchscreen computers in our pockets. We even have these gadgets now on our wrists. Why are we still displaying stuff like email as lists when we can start to think about displaying things using color, high resolution, employing touch, things like that? You probably heard about the stuff that went on in St. Louis, Ferguson, all that late last year. And this is a map of all of the Twitter users in St. Louis. And there's a couple of really interesting things that you can learn from this particular type of map. The first is that you kind of wonder, like, well, who's on Twitter in St. Louis? Is it differentially like more, African Americans or white people, or what's the story? And it turns out that it's pretty evenly spread across all groups. In fact, amongst minorities, Twitter usage is actually a little bit higher than it is amongst non-minority populations. But the thing that's really interesting here is that this group down here is kind of what I would call the mainstream culture. It's sort of the civic realm and newspapers and the TEDx type people, it's technology startups over here. And then you have up here a group of young white people. And then down here you have a group of young black people. And in the middle you have a void. There is like no connection really between this very large population of African Americans and this very large population of white folks. And the only thing that's sort of connecting is football over here on the very end. There's some people that are paying attention to football on both sides. And by that I mean American football, specifically college football. When I made this map, I realized that it actually bore a strong resemblance. You can also inspect the avatars to see like, okay, well, let's see who these people are. Do we know that they're black or white or what have you? And you can actually do that with a map like this. This is the same layout, but looking at their avatars. But I also realized that it looked a lot like my hometown of Baltimore in that we have a very eccentric network map where the sort of mainstream culture is down here, and then you have this very large population of young African Americans who are really disconnected from this end of the map entirely. I'm about there. The second E in geek is me. And so the people that are sort of in my bubble, in my filter bubble, really don't have a lot of awareness of what's going on this end at all. And likewise, these people barely know that these folks exist, or if they do know they exist, they don't care. So you can start to apply this kind of analysis to other places too, and you start to see some really interesting patterns emerge. You also notice that sports act as a connector between folks on each end of the spectrum. And it's also worth noting that back in December, when the stuff was sort of getting really out of hand in St. Louis, I made a prediction that if there was a crystallizing incident in Baltimore, that we would see probably a similar kind of reaction. And sure enough, in the last few weeks, you saw the news that there was a similar kind of outbreak of civil unrest and whatnot in Baltimore, which I should say has now mostly subsided, but we still have to work on fixing these underlying issues. This is San Francisco. And just to be clear again, this is not a geographic map, this is a map of communities. But, and this is focused strictly on the city of San Francisco, not the whole peninsula or whatever. But the thing that's interesting here is that there's this really large and growing population of geeks up here that is basically growing like a cancer on the rest of the city. And if you know anything about what's going on in San Francisco right now, you know that people are upset with the fact that housing prices have gotten really high, and it's becoming harder to find places to rent, and everybody feels like all of these young 20-something startup folks have crowded out the rest of the culture, and you can actually see that happening here. This group here is even so totally identifiable as to be Twitter employees, and I think Dick Costolo, the CEO of Twitter, is right about there. So you can see that this offers a different kind of lens to see a place through. This is Istanbul, one of your neighbors. And I pulled this data last fall, and I apologize that it's a little bit hard to read, but I'll point some things out here. This community here is kind of the tech, entrepreneur, civic kind of minded group down here that you see in a lot of places. And then over here you have kind of conservative religious folks and probably some stuff from the ruling party there. And then sports, again, acting in the middle, acting as a kind of a connector. And then this really large group down here, and I apologize that this is hard to read, but it's captioned young men, mostly frustrated young men, who really, really want girls to like them, and they write poetry to prove it. And that was given to me by a friend who analyzed a lot of the traffic coming out of that group. And, I think that fits with our understanding of reality there. You've got a lot of young men who are, sort of dealing with figuring out what they're going to do with their lives, jobs and girls and all the above. But they're tightly networked. There's a lot of them. This is by far the largest cohort of people in Istanbul. And I would imagine if we were to map all of Turkey, we would see something a lot like that as well. Over here you have a little group, it's called Young Adults Writing About Life. I think some of these people are what these people used to be. But again, the real question is, where is this cohort of people going to go? Are they going to kind of go up here and become part of this, tech startup, liberal-minded sort of group, or are they going to become more like the conservative religious ruling party type folks? Or are they going to become radicalized and join ISIS? We don't know. The other interesting thing that you can see up here is this group up here seems to be an army of troll bots. Unclear what exactly they're doing. We need to study that some more, but it's very clear that they're quite separate from the rest of the traffic in Istanbul. And it seems like maybe they're being used to reflect messages from the ruling party, although it's hard to tell. Need more study there. And then this is also interesting. This says sex generally, gay porn specifically. And what you find is that in places where the internet is actually censored, people can't get to the stuff that they like to get to on the internet, so they invent alternate ways of getting to it. And one of the ways that they've invented in Turkey is to use Twitter to do it, since Twitter is currently not blocked in Turkey. And they haven't yet decided that they want to block gay porn on Twitter, because that's too complicated. But anyway, you can see this pop up in a couple of places. You can see it again here in Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia also runs essentially from kind of liberal to conservative. You have females down here. You're not, that's pretty cool for Saudi Arabia. Down here you have teenage girls, and teenage girls are their own little island, because I guess either they shouldn't be talking to anyone else besides themselves, I guess, and nobody should be seen being talked to them. So that's why they're separate. And on the liberal end of the spectrum, you have the Hilal football organization acts as kind of a bridge here, although there seems to be a schism within the Halal community. I don't know. Nasser is another football team. And then up here you have a little group of what we've called marketer poets, which seems to be people that are monetizing the Quran. This is Barcelona, and pulled this last fall as well. And Barcelona is interesting in that it's pretty balanced. It's very well-rounded, kind of like a big furry beach ball. And I'll point out some interesting things here. This is Catalonian independence here, so that's obviously a big conversation for them. FC Barcelona, also a big conversation. And then a lot of writing of various kinds. Writers, criticism, sort of left-wing criticism here. Mainstream media in the middle, literature, libraries and books and whatnot over here. And then arts and culture and events here. And then entrepreneurs and tech kind of stuff up here. So again, really pretty well-rounded. It doesn't seem as though there's some really large disaffected minority population that is causing Barcelona to get out of balance. Just real quick, I've been traveling the last few weeks. I made a quick map of Poland. And one of the interesting things that you see here is that there's a pretty persistent in Eastern Europe group of Justin Bieber fans, One Direction fans, and then sometimes just sort of generic teenage girls. But usually there's kind of a schism between the Justin Bieber world and the One Direction world. There's people that are on the border, but most people have to choose sides. And that's sports acting kind of as a connector here. Hungary, again, a big One Direction, Justin Bieber schism. Budapest up here. And an interesting little group of K-pop fans. I don't know if you guys know what K-pop is, but it's like Asian pop. And there's a pretty large population of Asian folks in Budapest that are really into K-pop. So that's interesting to see. Bulgaria, the one you've been waiting for. So the first interesting thing to note about Bulgaria is that there isn't a ton of Twitter usage relative to the rest of Europe. And I think we could come up with some reasons why that might be. But I'd be more curious to hear what your thoughts are on that after you see this. So I'll kind of go through here, and bear in mind, this is basically the entire country. I didn't just focus on Sofia. I looked at the entire country, and I let the algorithms run for quite some time to get as much as I could. And this is what I found. So up here, the tech startups Digital K world is up here. Digital K account is like right there. And then news and media type stuff over here. Design, architecture, photography, I sort of labeled it that because I didn't have a ton of better input to kind of for sure nail what these folks were really interested in, but it definitely seemed heavy in that world. And then politics, Bulgarian nationalism, and culture over here. Now, not entirely surprisingly, Russian culture over here. And I should point out that, again, the things that are at the opposite ends of the map have the least in common with each other. So I'm pretty sure the folks that are interested in Russian culture really aren't that interested in Bulgarian nationalism. And then Bulgaria-Russia issues, kind of in the middle, seems to be the deal, and some news outlets and whatnot. Anybody would like to dig into this data more with me, I'd be happy to look at it. But the interesting thing is that there just isn't that much usage. It's pretty low. And then up here, you got Bankso as its own little community. And then, I'm going to pronounce this wrong, Blagoevgrad. I did the best I could. But anyway, they're kind of off in their own little world, too. And that's kind of it. That's Bulgaria in a nutshell right there. At least Twitter-wise. Now, I should also show you this. I went back and looked at, of active current accounts, the growth curve is something like this. There was a huge spike in 2009, roughly, like the beginning of 2009, and then it's been dropping ever since. Now, part of that is that, the people who need to be on are already on, and it's not grown a bunch since then. But it's also worth noting that it is dropping off. This is also just kind of interesting. This is a map that I made pulling in a lot of stuff from around the region. And I should point out that there's a lot of stuff that's not on here, things like Romania and Greece and Turkey and things that you would kind of expect to be with something like this. And some of that is just limitations of computing power and stuff. But, it's a little balkanized. Imagine that. You do have, Belgrade up here, Sarajevo, Zagreb. Zagreb and Croatia, they're sort of in, there's a divide there because there's like the rural versus urban thing going on there. And then Bosnia, Herzegovina, Sarajevo, same kind of thing. Slovenia, Russian Bulgarians hanging out over here. Sofia down here, Pristina and Kosovo here. And then Budapest and Hungary, kind of, again, the divide between rural and urban. I was in Puerto Rico last week. I thought you guys might just like to see another place and see kind of how you guys are comparing. A whole lot of traffic coming out of Puerto Rico. For those of you that don't know, it's a U.S. territory off the coast of Florida. It's been a U.S. possession since the Spanish-American War. There's about 3.6 million people there, and I would say that the Twitter usage is something like 20 times higher than Bulgaria, easily. And I don't know whether that's a Spanish culture thing, because it's a pretty heavily Spanish-influenced culture there. But you can see that it's basically divided between young people and students, and again, a good One Direction Justin Bieber group down here. And then over here, kind of the rest of the culture with tech entrepreneurship kind of being on the edge here. And then you can also see that there was a big spike in 2009 in Puerto Rico, and then it dropped off. But then a really large influx of students in like 2012, and then dropping off again. So, what's the larger import of this stuff? If you think about these social media-powered movements, whether you're talking about Gezi Park or Ukraine or Hong Kong, all these things have kind of treated social media like it's a black box that somehow or another, we'll just tweet a lot and our revolution will happen, right? Not so, and I believe that our ability to understand how these movements work is limited by the access to this kind of data that we actually have. And that kind of data is being threatened right now. It's not easy to get this stuff. The stuff that I've gotten out of Twitter is one part of it, but imagine if we could look at this through the lens of Facebook or LinkedIn or WhatsApp or SMS. There's all these different data channels that can tell us substantially the same story from different angles, but we need to be able to get to that data to do that. And so like things like this is my own personal Facebook graph, and you can see it's kind of divided between Baltimore, Silicon Valley, and TED are the main groups, but I can't get that anymore. That's been cut off as of this month, and the tools to be able to get that data. Likewise, this map that I made of employment in Baltimore can't do that anymore because of API restrictions that have been put in place just this month. So in some ways, our access to this kind of data is sort of like the railroads. We're giving these large companies permission to build monopolies. And what are we getting in exchange when we click like or follow or what have you? What do we get back from that? And how do we understand our culture? And is it maybe time that we start a conversation around getting some of that data back for our own use so that we can understand and manage our society better? So if you're interested in this stuff, there's some interesting sites here. You can take a picture of that. I'd be happy to send anybody a link to that as well. There's some tools that I use to make some of these things, but I will warn you that this is a complicated, endeavor to get involved with, and it will eat your life if you really become passionate about it. You'll have to travel to conferences all the time. So anyway, that's me. If you'd like to chat more, I'll be here the rest of the conference, and thank you very much.